Clint returned home after a long separation, expecting to see his loving wife, but instead, he was met with a cold stare and a mysterious note. "You know nothing." These words wouldn't leave his mind. When he finally met Alice, the woman he trusted, her eyes revealed the truth. "I knew it all along. You have no idea what awaits you in this story." Clint glanced over his shoulder. He knew she wouldn't be alone, but what he saw exceeded all his expectations. Clint sat in his car, watching through the window as the late summer sun glistened on the water's surface, reflecting a crimson hue of the sunset. His heart pounded faster with excitement, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. 6 months on the front lines had been a tough period, but he was finally home. Chloe, his wife, was waiting for him, though he wasn't sure if it was the same home he had left behind. He remembered the moment he said goodbye to her. Chloe had always taken pride in handling everything on her own, and he trusted her. She wasn't one of those women who dreamed of perfect relationships. No, Chloe was practical, serious, and goal-driven. She had been his support, his strength. But now, as he watched this peaceful scene through the window, he felt different. Maybe it was just his imagination, but everything pointed to the fact that after such a long separation, more had changed between them than he had anticipated. Realizing he couldn't stall any longer, he got out of the car and headed toward the house. He walked across the yard, inhaling the familiar scent of flowers and the fresh air left behind by the rain. But the warmth he had expected from this reunion wasn't there. His heartbeat quickened, and he felt like a stranger stepping into unfamiliar territory. Could Chloe have changed that much in 6 months? When Clint opened the door, he saw her in the hallway. She stood in front of the mirror, gathering her hair. Chloe looked just as she always had, beautiful, elegant, with that same perfect posture. She smiled at him, but it was a different kind of smile than the one he remembered. It was a smile that concealed something more. "You came back earlier than I expected," she said without taking her eyes off the mirror. Clint felt his hand tighten around the doorknob. He couldn't pinpoint what exactly was wrong with her voice. He stepped closer, standing behind her, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume mixed with her hair. "I know you weren't expecting me so soon," he replied, trying to mask his nervousness. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. She wasn't excited. She wasn't happy to see him. There was something else in her gaze, something cold and distant, something he hadn't noticed before. "I'm planning a party," she said with a calm smile. "It's for you, or rather, not exactly for you, but you're welcome to come." "A party?" Clint repeated, confused. "Yes, a small one, with a special surprise. You don't mind, do you?" She took a step back, allowing him to take in her full appearance, and his gaze lingered on her flawless look. How had everything changed? What was different about her eyes? About her emotions? "I thought we'd spend time together," Clint said, studying her reaction. There was something in her words that made him feel uncertain, something he couldn't quite place. "Maybe later," she replied, her voice devoid of any sincerity. That's when he realized this wasn't just a party. This was her way of creating distance between them. Too much had changed while he was away, and he had no idea how it had happened so quickly. "Chloe, is something wrong?" His voice carried concern. She looked at him again and simply said, "No, everything's fine. I just didn't think you'd be back so soon." And at that moment, he felt a tight knot form in his chest. Chloe was distant from him. He could feel it in her every move. Maybe it was just his imagination, but he was ready to accept whatever reality lay ahead. The whole situation already felt strange, and he couldn't understand why she was acting this way. "I want to see how you're planning this celebration," he said, trying to show interest. He couldn't let this go without figuring out what was really happening. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the woman standing before him was a stranger. She turned to grab her phone, and he noticed something odd in her movements. She really wasn't the same as before. Something was gnawing at him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He refused to believe it was just paranoia. But the moment she turned back to him, there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't decipher. No, this wasn't just a shift in attitude. It was something bigger, something that could change everything between them, something that was waiting for him. Something was wrong. Clint stood at the threshold, looking at Chloe. Something was wrong. His heart clenched with the feeling that he wasn't ready for what was about to happen. Clint closed the door and took a few steps down the hallway. His thoughts were racing. He had returned home, where his wife, the woman he loved and had always considered his greatest support, was supposed to be waiting for him. War had taken him away for 6 months, and he had decided that what he wanted most was to return to a normal life. But now, standing before Chloe, her cold demeanor cast doubt on everything he thought he knew about her support. "You look like something's changed," he said, trying to understand what was going on. His voice was unnaturally calm, though his heart was pounding faster. Chloe turned to him, her hands empty, and in her gaze, there was no longer that warm glow Clint once remembered. She looked at him for only a moment and replied, "I just got used to you not being here. That's all that changed." Clint felt a chill in his chest. She was distant, too distant for the woman he had left at home. He tried to reassure himself, telling himself that it was just because he had been gone for so long, that she needed time to adjust to his return. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only part of something much bigger. "I thought we could spend this evening together. Just you and me," he said, trying to re-establish the connection between them. She tucked her hair behind her ear, as if it were a natural movement, and took a step back. "Sorry, I had other plans for the evening. Just a little celebration." A celebration? He couldn't understand why she hadn't told him about it earlier. Why now, when he was back, was this so important to her? He felt like a stranger in his own home. "You didn't mention this to me," he said, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I thought we could talk, spend time together." "I know, but this party isn't for you," she replied, looking at him with an expression that made his heart tighten with unease. Clint couldn't understand why her words hurt more than they should have. This wasn't just distance. It was a cold indifference that made him feel like she was expecting something different from him. She turned and walked into the kitchen, and Clint, unable to say anything, followed her. He didn't know what he was looking for, answers or just the support he so desperately needed after everything he had been through. "Chloe, I just want to understand," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "What happened?" She stopped and looked at him, but once again, there was no emotion. "Nothing happened, Clint. You just came back late, and I decided to do something for myself. That's all." For herself? All these months, he had thought that her support was just as strong as his desire to return home. But now, he felt like everything he had hoped for was falling apart right before his eyes. "You think this is normal?" His voice rose as something inside him exploded with frustration. "We never talked about this? I lost 6 months. Is this normal for you?" Chloe sighed and raised an eyebrow. "You're overreacting, Clint. Things just aren't the way you imagined. I needed some space. And this party is my way of taking care of myself." Clint realized she didn't want him to be part of this. This wasn't just a party. This was her distancing herself, her way of moving on without him. And all he felt was bitterness and sorrow. He walked back to the living room and sat on the couch, watching as Chloe moved around the house, busying herself with her own affairs, leaving him behind. She looked like he was just a shadow that had no right to be in her space. His heart was pounding, and doubt crept in. Had he been the same way during the war, when he was away? Had she grown so accustomed to life without him that these months apart had become her new normal? And did he still belong in that life? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that her coldness wasn't just emotional distance. It could be the result of something much bigger, and he was ready to find out what it was. He had come home after 6 months away, but what he saw was nothing like what he had expected. Clint sat on the couch, hands resting on his knees, watching his wife as she moved through the house, acting as if he wasn't even there. Chloe was occupied with her tasks, talking on the phone, laughing with someone, as if nothing had happened. She didn't look the way he remembered her. Over time, an invisible rift had formed between them. Chloe had always been reserved, but now her detachment felt like more than just indifference. It was like a wall that separated her from him, and the feeling of unease inside him only grew. "Chloe, we need to talk," he said after a pause, trying to interrupt her conversation. She glanced at him briefly, then turned back to her phone, laughing again. She clearly wasn't listening to him. Clint felt frustration building in his chest. All these months at war, he had believed she was waiting for him with anticipation, that their bond wouldn't suffer because of the distance. And now, he was starting to doubt it. He lost control of his emotions. "Do you hear me, Chloe?" His voice came out sharp. She glanced at him again but didn't answer, just turned away and continued talking. He couldn't take this indifference any longer. "Why don't you want to talk to me?" The question was the breaking point of his patience. She finally put down the phone and looked at him with that same cold stare. "I hear you, Clint. Just don't make me out to be a fool. You don't want to know the truth." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't understand why she was so indifferent. What had happened during the time he was gone? Why was her behavior so sharp? The truth? He leaned forward, trying to grasp her meaning. "What do you mean?" Chloe sighed but didn't answer right away. She looked at him with a challenge in her eyes. "What do I mean? You want to know what happened these past months? You want to know who was here when you weren't? You want to know why I stopped waiting for you?" Her voice grew sharper, and Clint realized that something deep had happened, something he had failed to notice. His heart began to beat faster. He couldn't understand why she was so hostile, why she was so distant. He wanted to hear the truth, but she already looked like it was too much for her to say. I came back, Chloe. I'm home. Why don't you want to talk to me?" She finally turned to him and said, "Because you weren't here when I needed you. You were far away, and I learned how to live without you. I couldn't just sit at home, waiting for you to come back, not knowing if you ever would." Clint fell silent, feeling a crushing weight in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no idea what she had been through while he was gone. He had always believed that stability and support in their family were important to her, but now, it seemed like everything had changed. Were you with someone while I was gone?" His voice wavered, but he couldn't stop himself from asking the question that had been haunting him. Chloe said nothing. Her gaze became even colder. "Yes, I was, Clint. I can't wait for you forever. You have your war, and I have my life." Clint felt everything crumbling around him. All his stability, all his belief that they could find each other again, disintegrated like sand slipping through his fingers. His heart pounded so fast that it felt like his lungs couldn't handle the weight of it. "I can't believe this," he whispered. Chloe stood in front of him, calm, though in her eyes he saw pain. This wasn't just betrayal. This was disappointment in him, the feeling that she was no longer part of his world, and he was no longer part of hers. "You don't want to hear the truth, Clint," she said coldly. "You want to stay in your little war, in your routines, while I want more than just waiting for you." Clint felt his entire world shift in an instant. He didn't know how to live with the truth he had just learned. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her. And what now? How could they go back if everything was already destroyed? As he sat there in silence, Chloe glanced at him, then returned to her tasks. She was no longer the woman he had loved. And now, Clint didn't know what to do next. Clint stood in the doorway, trying to process what he had just learned. But when he looked at Chloe, the feeling of betrayal didn't fade. If anything, it grew even stronger. Chloe had already started pulling away from him, escaping into her own reality, while he was still struggling to believe what had happened. He knew her words were true, but he couldn't just leave it at that. Clint looked at his wife again, who now sat on the couch, quietly scrolling through her phone messages. His heart pounded like it had on the battlefield. He had always believed in his own strength, but now that strength felt useless compared to the bitter sting of betrayal. "You don't want to be with me anymore, do you?" he asked, still trying to make sense of it. His voice was calm, but his heartbeat quickened with every word. Chloe looked at him with such an indifferent expression that Clint felt the fire rising in his chest again. "I don't want to be with you the way you are," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I can't keep living in the waiting, watching you drift further from reality." Clint felt his heart clench with pain. He didn't understand what had happened to Chloe. Where was the woman he had loved? Why had she become so cold, so distant? Why was her soul so far away from him? He was willing to do anything to understand what had happened, but the answers to his questions were already gone. But then, he noticed something that made his heart stop. Chloe must not have realized that her phone was lying on the couch, plugged into the charger, with a few messages flashing on the screen. He tried to ignore them, but he couldn't. Clint picked up the phone and looked at the screen. There was only one new message, but it was enough to make his pulse race. "We're waiting for this to happen, and I can feel the moment getting closer. You're not coming back tomorrow, are you?" Clint tried to put the phone down, but it was too late. His mind was already working through the information. He read the message again and again, but he still couldn't understand what it meant. He turned back to Chloe, but this time, his voice sounded different. "Who was it?" His question was simple, but his tone made it clear that this wasn't just curiosity. Chloe didn't answer right away. She turned away and focused on her tasks again, but he noticed how her hand trembled when she saw his expression. That was all he needed to realize. He was dealing with an even bigger lie than he had thought. "Who was it, Chloe?" This time, he couldn't hide the anxiety in his voice. She looked at him, and a small flicker of irritation appeared in her eyes. But once again, she answered in the same cold tone. "You don't need to know." Clint couldn't believe how easily she was pushing him away again. It became clear to him that something was very wrong. Chloe hadn't just betrayed him once. She was trying to keep something important from him, hiding yet another secret. But his determination only grew stronger. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let her avoid this conversation. "You're lying to me, Chloe. You weren't just with someone you—" He hesitated. His voice strained. "You fell in love with him, didn't you?" Chloe lifted her gaze, and for a moment, her eyes flared with anger, but she immediately suppressed her emotions. "That's none of your business." Clint felt his anger rising. He knew this was more than just physical betrayal. It was deeper, so much deeper than he had imagined. "I respect you, Clint, but we are not the same people we were before." Chloe stood up, her voice growing colder, even harsh. "I don't want you to stay here and torture yourself." Those words struck him like a direct blow to the heart. Chloe hadn't just betrayed him. She had decided to move on. And this time, even her request for him to leave was just another confirmation of her betrayal. Clint felt like a stranger in his own home. He couldn't take this chaos anymore. He decided it was time to find out who this man was and uncover the whole truth. But before he could take another step, he saw something new in her eyes, a cold determination, like someone who had made their choice long ago and had no intention of changing it. Clint stood in the doorway, realizing that his life would never be the same again. Chloe, his wife, had betrayed him, and this was only the beginning of what he was about to discover. Chloe stared at him with an eerie calm, her face expressionless, like someone who had already made a decision that had no turning back. She sat on the couch, not even trying to look guilty. For her, it was settled. Her gaze was cold and distant, as if she had already detached herself from him and everything they once shared. Clint took a step forward, feeling his heart pounding faster. It was hard for him to accept what had happened, and he couldn't just walk away without understanding everything. "Did you cheat on me, Chloe?" he asked, his voice steady, though a storm raged inside him. Chloe didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, as if carefully weighing every word he had spoken. Then, when the silence became unbearable, she finally spoke. "You're right. I was with him," she said calmly. "But it's not what you think. It wasn't just cheating." Clint, struggling to keep control, took a step closer to her. "What do you mean?" His question was more of a challenge than a conversation. He couldn't understand her composure. Chloe looked away, staring at the floor. Then, with a sigh, she finally said, "I stopped missing you, Clint. You left, and I stayed here. All I had was emptiness, and I needed something real. He was there when I needed someone, but I can't say I love him." She lifted her gaze and met his eyes again. Clint felt his heart clench at her words. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about the fact that he wasn't the person Chloe had been looking for anymore. He couldn't understand why his love hadn't been enough for her. "And who is he?" Clint asked, his voice turning bitter. Chloe hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to tell him. Then, realizing there was no point in hiding it anymore, she finally said, "His name is Jake. He's an old friend of mine, and we spent a lot of time together while you were gone. He helped me get through it." Clint closed his eyes, trying to process the information. His heart ached from what had happened, But even more, he was torn by the question of whether this had only been a physical betrayal, or something far worse. I see, he replied, trying not to let his pain show. But that doesn't give you the right to lie to me. You could have told me everything the moment I got back. Chloe lifted her hands slightly, as if trying to justify herself. I was afraid you wouldn't understand, that it wasn't just about sex. It was about me trying to find myself. And when you came back, everything wasn't the same anymore. Clint closed his eyes, trying to keep his emotions under control. His mind was battling his feelings, but right now, he needed more than just answers. He could feel that Chloe was still hiding another truth from him. But you still haven't told me who Jake is, he said, keeping his voice steady. How did you know you needed him? Chloe suddenly felt her heartbeat quicken. She got up from the couch, her movements turning nervous, and she started pacing around the room, searching for the right words. It seemed like she wasn't prepared for this question. Jake, he's my friend, but he was also with someone who helped me learn more about you. Clint looked at her, a newfound curiosity flashing in his eyes. What do you mean? Chloe took a deep breath and looked at him as if deciding whether to reveal more. Finally, she said, Jake found out that you were on a mission with some people I couldn't understand. He discovered things you were hiding, and some of them, he used to influence me. Clint felt his heartbeat speed up. He couldn't believe that Chloe knew more than he had assumed. Now, everything was getting far more complicated. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was a whole plan, manipulation, and he was probably just a pawn in this game. What are you trying to say? Clint asked, unable to hide his confusion. He influenced me, Clint. He showed me things I couldn't see when you were home. This wasn't just cheating. This was him bringing me to a new level. Clint stood there, staring at his wife as she changed her version of events yet again. He now understood that it wasn't just Chloe who had betrayed him. Jake had been her accomplice, and this went beyond emotions. Now, he stood at a crossroads. Leave things as they were or find a way to expose the truth and make her answer for it. Clint stood in the doorway, looking at his wife, and he could feel the dark abyss between them widening. Chloe hadn't just betrayed him. She was part of a bigger game, and he was ready to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it would be. Are you serious, Chloe? Clint's voice was firm, barely containing his anger. His eyes were dark with disappointment and pain. Now that he had learned about her betrayal and manipulation, everything looked completely different. He couldn't just let this go. Chloe, standing before him, started nervously twisting a strand of her hair around her finger, her gaze shifting to the side. She no longer looked as confident as before. Maybe she hadn't expected Clint to put all the pieces together, to know what was really happening. But now, there was no turning back for him. Clint, I didn't want it to turn out like this, she began, her voice slightly shaken. I just couldn't do it anymore. You couldn't do it anymore? Are you serious? He took a step toward her, catching the faint scent of her perfume, a scent that now felt unfamiliar. She was no longer the woman he had loved. Chloe shut her eyes, struggling to find the right words. Jake, he just helped me, she said, her lips forming the words, but they sounded empty, like an excuse that didn't make sense. Clint, I didn't know what to do. I felt empty when you were gone, and he was there. There was nothing in her words that could satisfy Clint. All those months on his mission, he had imagined returning home to his family, to something safe and stable. But now, everything had changed. He was just a piece in a game where he no longer belonged. Not cheating was your choice, Chloe, he replied coldly. And you don't just not know what to do. You knew exactly what you were doing. You did it on purpose. Chloe lifted her head, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were sad but also proud. She knew what she had done, and she no longer tried to hide it. Maybe I should have taken a different path. But now, it doesn't matter, she said, her voice steady, though there was something in it that sounded like resignation. Clint felt his chest tighten, but he couldn't allow himself to show weakness. This wasn't the time. He had too many questions, and he couldn't lose control of the situation. Who else knows, Chloe? His question was sharp because he could feel that this wasn't the end. There was something more she wasn't telling him. He needed to know. She held her breath and looked away again. She hesitated, but she knew she couldn't hide it from him any longer. "Jake," she began, her voice not as firm as before. "He was my friend, but it didn't stop with just him. This was bigger than you think." Clint felt his heart clench. Something about her words, about her entire demeanor, was deeply unsettling. She was trying to hide something more. A question burned in his mind. Was this really just her betrayal? Or was there something even bigger she was keeping from him? "What else, Chloe? What aren't you saying?" he asked, taking a step toward her. His voice was low but firm. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Her face turned pale, and she turned to him as if ready to spill everything she had been hiding. There was a brutal truth in her eyes that she could no longer conceal. "He wasn't the only one, Clint." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was seeing others. I can't say why I did it. I couldn't just leave everything as it was. You were so distant, you didn't see me. I was alone." Clint felt his heart pound harder and then go silent. He felt as if all his hopes of rebuilding their marriage, of making everything right, shattered into tiny pieces. I couldn't live in a world where you were absent and couldn't understand me," Chloe added, her gaze direct but without remorse. Clint felt a coldness wrapping around him. He stood there, absorbing her words, realizing that his soul, his feelings for this woman, no longer mattered. "I can't go back to what was, Clint," Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm. He stood, not knowing what to do. Just a minute ago, he thought she was the most important thing in his life, but now everything felt so empty and fake. Betrayal, manipulation, other men who had entered her life while he was away. All of it had become his new reality. Clint didn't say a word. He turned and walked out of the house, feeling the weight of pain pressing against his chest. He realized he had lost more than just his wife. He had lost the very idea of what family was, what trust meant. Now, he had only one question. How was he supposed to move forward when all that remained was emptiness? Clint felt the dark chasm between him and Chloe only growing deeper. He couldn't leave her, but he couldn't return to this life either. How do you decide when love and betrayal intertwine into one tangled mess? He sat in his car, staring at the familiar house. Clint was almost ready to go back to Chloe, but the thoughts of betrayal that had turned into something serious tormented him. He still hadn't found a way to make things right because there was someone new who was filling the emptiness. His heart beat faster when he thought of Alice. Alice was different. She was kind, caring, yet strong, stubborn, and willing to fight for her love. She was nothing like Chloe. Clint had met her by chance at a cafe a few weeks ago. Her eyes, her smile, everything about her felt so real. She wasn't part of the world in which he had been trying to find himself after so many years of marriage. Alice didn't ask unnecessary questions when Clint told her about his struggles, but at the same time, she was wise enough not to interfere in his personal life. She was there for him in moments of doubt, sadness, even when he seemed so lost. She was the support he now reached for. But was he ready for a new beginning? Could he really leave everything with Chloe behind? It was hard to make a decision. Clint felt he couldn't immediately go to Alice without resolving things with his wife first, but his heart was pulling him toward her. He couldn't just leave everything as it was. His feelings were tangled like threads in a knotted ball, and he didn't know how to untangle them. Needing to find an answer, Clint stepped out of his car and walked toward the house where Chloe was waiting for him. She had no idea what he was going through, and he didn't know how to tell her that their marriage had become too complicated to salvage. He didn't know whether he should try to restore their relationship or if he should simply walk away and find a new path to happiness. But how could he explain to Chloe that her betrayal and lies had changed everything? He stood in front of the door, trying to make the right decision. "Clint, you're not sleeping again," her voice came through the door. Chloe already knew he had come back, and she opened it. Clint hesitated but stepped inside. Chloe looked the same as before, beautiful, stubborn, with an incredible ability to manipulate. She was still the woman he had once loved, but now her face no longer stirred the same emotions in him. She no longer felt like a place where he could find comfort. He sensed that his feelings for her were fading, yet he was afraid to take the final step. "Are you still thinking about it?" she asked, sitting on the couch. Clint sat next to her, trying to find the words, but he couldn't. All the emotions, all the questions spinning in his head, kept him from being open. Chloe looked at him, but in her eyes, there was something more than just curiosity. He felt she was waiting for him to come back to her, to return to what they once had. But was it real? Was this love, or just habit? "Clint, I don't want to hide anything from you anymore," Chloe said, looking into his eyes. "You know I love you. I made a mistake. I understand that, but I want to fix everything." Clint didn't answer right away. His heart was heavy with the battle between past and future. Everything was so tangled, and he couldn't figure out how to move forward. "Chloe, Clint fell silent as memories of Alice resurfaced in his mind. His feelings for her were completely different. She didn't demand anything, didn't try to convince him. She was just there. She was real, honest, and he felt that maybe that was what he had truly been missing. "I know you're still thinking about what happened between us," Chloe said, leaning toward him. "But I'm willing to work on us, Clint. Give us a chance." Clint took a deep breath. His heart was beating faster from the struggle of emotions. He loved Chloe, and they had so much history together. But Alice was different. She was his new beginning, and he couldn't leave her without giving her a chance. "I don't know, Chloe," he said. "I can't tell you that I still want to be with you. My heart is elsewhere." Chloe pulled away, her face turning cold and empty. She remained silent, and every glance he gave her felt like the last. He could no longer close his eyes to the truth. "Are you leaving?" she asked quietly. Clint stood at a crossroads with no easy answer. He couldn't deny himself the chance to be happy. He decided to leave it all behind, even if it hurt. "I'm leaving, Chloe," he said finally. "I can't be with you anymore." He walked away, leaving Chloe in a silence greater than any words could be. He didn't know if he was making the right choice, but one thing was clear. His path led to Alice, even if it wouldn't be easy. He wasn't sure if this was love, but it was what he needed at this moment. Clint couldn't understand why his heart ached so much. Every step he took brought him closer to a new beginning, yet he still felt the weight pressing down on him. How do you choose between two worlds when one of them leaves you with nothing but emptiness? Clint had left Chloe, but the thoughts wouldn't leave him. He was sitting in his car again, but he was no longer sure about his decision. His heart pounded so hard it was difficult to breathe. All his feelings pulled him toward Alice, but at the same time, he was still haunted by what he had left behind. He couldn't forget the way Chloe had looked at him when he said he was leaving. It wasn't an angry or vengeful reaction. It was just bitter, silent betrayal. She knew it was the end. But was it the right step? He still wasn't sure. How many times in life do we stand at a crossroads where every decision has consequences? Clint tried to push aside his doubts, but they clung to him like a weight around his neck. How could he leave everything they had built so quickly? How could he simply sever a bond that had been forged over years of shared life? Clint felt that this was more than just betrayal. It was an internal battle between what had been and what could be. His steps had led him to Alice, but he wasn't ready for the possibility that she might not be ready for him. Driving through the city streets, he couldn't find peace. Everything he saw reminded him of the past. But now, he looked at it with different eyes. Every little detail, every sign, every street, everything felt different, and it hurt. He couldn't deny that he was tempted by the idea of a fresh start, but inside, he was still cracked from the betrayal that Chloe had left behind. Alice wasn't part of the world where he had once lived. She was completely different, with her own way of seeing things. Her gaze, her words, her gestures, everything was new, yet safe. He was ready to leave behind his painful past reality and throw himself into the embrace of this new world. And now, he had arrived. Alice was waiting for him, sitting in the same cafe where they had first met. Her eyes met his, and he immediately felt how hard it was to break the connection with Chloe, even though she had betrayed him. But what had happened was inevitable. He had to move forward. "Hi, Clint," Alice smiled when she saw him. It was her usual smile, but now it no longer seemed just kind. It was warm, sincere, and he felt that she was ready to give him more. She was the world he longed to enter. But doubts started creeping into him. "Hi," Clint replied. His voice was subdued, as if something was holding him back from fully surrendering to this moment. "How are you?" Alice didn't notice his inner turmoil and seemed cheerful. She didn't know all of his doubts. She only saw Clint the way she wanted to see him, and that made her ready for a new beginning. "I'm good. I was waiting for you," she said, lifting her coffee cup. "How was your day?" Clint picked up his cup, but he couldn't stop thinking about what was happening inside his soul. His heart pounded harder, but not from joy, rather, from fear. Was this the right choice? The decision had been made, but would it only lead to more pain if Alice ended up disappointed in him, just as Chloe had? "Honestly, not how I expected," Clint admitted. "Everything is very confusing." Alice set her cup down on the table and looked at him with curiosity. "What happened?" "You look lost," she said. Clint remained silent. It wasn't easy for him to talk about his past, especially about the moments when he had betrayed his own feelings. He didn't want Alice to feel like she was part of this tangled situation. "It's not that simple," he continued. "I don't want you to think I'm weak, but I haven't figured everything out yet. I feel like my heart is being torn apart." Alice leaned in closer and gently placed her hand on his. She was very understanding and didn't try to pressure him. She understood his struggles, but her patience and support were something he couldn't find anywhere else. "I don't want you to feel guilty," she said softly. "I'm here, and I'm ready to be with you if that's what you want. But I won't force you into anything." Clint felt his heart begin to calm, but traces of doubt were still on his face. Did he have the right to let go of his past? What if he did, and everything fell apart again? "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means so much to me, but I need more time." Alice nodded and smiled. "I understand, and I'll be here when you're ready." Clint looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, hope appeared in his heart. But could he move on and leave everything behind? Would this new love be enough to help him find peace and clarity? He didn't know yet, but he had a chance to find out. And so, Clint sat in the same cafe where they had first met, but now he had a greater purpose: to find his way forward and discover the answer that would allow him to move on without looking back. Clint turned the key in the lock, but even in the silence that enveloped his home, he felt that solving this problem wasn't going to be easy. Every step he took felt heavy, and his thoughts, like thick fog, refused to clear. What next? Those moments with Alice seemed to bring more questions than answers. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that all his decisions had led him to a dead end. Now, he was sitting in his empty house, which was once filled with laughter and life, but now the silence felt worse than any argument. He felt his soul tighten with the realization that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite grasp what it was. His thoughts were interrupted by a call. He glanced at the screen, unsure of what to do. The number was unfamiliar. It was the disease of time. People from the past had a way of reappearing in his life at the most unexpected moments. "Hello, Clint. It's Chloe. I need to talk to you. There's something important you need to know." Chloe's voice carried a tone that made his heart skip a beat. Clint didn't answer right away. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but none of them gave him a clear answer. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to dive back into the painful memories of how everything had gone wrong. And yet, the unknown voice kept calling again and again, and against that backdrop, even his thoughts of Alice didn't seem as important anymore. "We need to talk," Chloe said again. He could no longer avoid the call. His mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. Did he really want to hear this? Was he ready to go back into the chaos he had been trying so hard to leave behind? With a bitter feeling in his heart, Clint pressed the green button and picked up the phone. "Hello. What happened?" he asked. "I know you don't want to hear this, Clint, but I have to tell you something. It's something that changes everything we thought we knew." Chloe spoke honestly, but her voice was calm, almost detached. "What do you mean?" Clint asked, feeling the tension begin to rise again. "You won't understand until you see it for yourself," she said, her words only deepening his suspicion. What kind of news had she been keeping to herself for so long? What else could she say that would change everything that had happened between them? "We don't have much time. All these games are over, Clint. You need to know the truth before it's too late." "What are you trying to say, Chloe?" His voice grew tense. The feeling that something catastrophic was about to happen consumed him once again. I didn't betray you, if that's what you're thinking. But there's something else. Another person, Clint. They were part of all this. Clint fell silent. His heart clenched, but he couldn't say a word. Another person? Another betrayal? His thoughts spiraled into confusion. What did this mean for him? If Chloe hadn't cheated, then who had caused him the most pain? You need to see it for yourself, Chloe insisted, her voice becoming more urgent. I'm waiting for you at the old place, where it all began. Clint heard a faint sound and realized Chloe had hung up. He sat there in silence, unsure of what to do with this information. He couldn't just forget about it. A feeling was growing inside him that this wasn't just a coincidence. Was this all part of some greater scheme, an old game he had failed to notice? From here, the plot could develop in several directions, introducing new revelations and surprises for Clint. Perhaps he will come to believe that letting go of his past and finding peace with Alice is the right choice. But will his new relationship with Alice be as perfect as he hoped? Time is needed to resolve everything, and the intrigue continues to deepen. Who is really manipulating Clint? Chloe? Alice? Or is he deceiving himself? He didn't know if this was the real truth, or just another trap he had fallen into. His heart pounded faster, and everything inside him refused to believe what he had just been told. Someone was setting the stage for a big game. But who? Clint stood in front of the old cafe where he and Chloe had first met. That day, they could never have imagined how much their lives would change. He mentally reconstructed the details of their first meeting. So much time had passed, but now, standing here in front of the empty cafe, he felt that something important was about to become clear. Clint glanced at his watch. She was supposed to arrive, but she was late. Was this just another game? But why? A few minutes later, a figure entered the cafe, one he recognized immediately. It was Alice, his wife. How had she ended up here? Alice, Clint called out, unable to comprehend what was happening. She gave a slight smile, but there was sorrow in her eyes. You thought I didn't know about your little secrets? She said, barely audible. Clint couldn't understand why she was here and what was going on. Not long ago, they had seemingly resolved all their issues, and now it felt like another painful cycle was beginning. What are you trying to say, Alice? Is this another game? Clint asked, feeling his heartbeat quicken. She stepped closer, and he was overcome by the sensation that he was about to fall into an abyss. You don't want to know the truth, Clint. You really don't, Alice said, her voice shifting, taking on darker tones. But you're forcing me to say it, and now everything is going to change. Her words struck like a blow, and he felt something was terribly wrong. What was the real reason for this meeting? Why was Alice here? And why was she becoming so cold? You have no idea how it all started, do you? She said, an unpredictable glint flashing in her eyes. Clint swallowed nervously, still unable to piece everything together. His plan had been simple, to deal with Chloe, talk things through, and return to a normal life with Alice. But now, everything seemed completely different. You did everything right, Clint, except I had to learn the whole truth. And now I know that you will never understand what happened until it's too late. Alice sighed quietly and looked him straight in the eyes. Clint couldn't believe what he was hearing. It seemed he was part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. I knew you could feel it, and this was our last chance to break the cycle, she said, raising her hand, holding what looked like a note. This is the key to everything, Clint, and I was ready to give you this chance. You respected me, but you could never understand why your efforts never yielded results. With those words, she placed the note right in front of him and walked toward the cafe exit. Clint was left alone, feeling as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. The note had no signature, but he understood. Everything that had happened was just part of a plan. What did she mean by that? At that moment, he realized the real deception wasn't in what they had said, but in what they had hidden. All those years he thought he knew his wife. She had been keeping a part of the truth from him. Now, after this meeting, he understood that even his relationship with Chloe had been just another piece of a larger game. This is only the beginning, Clint, he thought, clenching the note in his hand. And who knows what comes next?